Hi, I'm Becky Edwards, the Chief Communications Officer at the ACLU, and I'm joined here with my colleague Danielle Silber, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships. We are so grateful to Theory for inviting us to take over their Instagram as part of the Be Heard Digital Conversation series. This is an opportunity to bring important dialogue to a global audience and I encourage everyone to tune in, get inspired, and have your voices heard about some of the topics we're going to talk about today. Over to you, Danielle, to say a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Silber, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have the privilege at the ACLU of working with a team of amazing colleagues to help build relationships with companies and brands in order to help advance the ACLU's mission. So this conversation that we get to have with Becky and ideally with the broader Theory community is really critical so that we can think about the role that all of us as individuals can play, as organizations and as brands in really changing our culture to advance civil liberties and civil rights.
So maybe a little bit of grounding on the ACLU. We are actually celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. The American Civil Liberties Union was founded in 1920 as the nation's guardian of civil liberties. What does that mean? For people like me who grew up with Schoolhouse Rock, we're familiar with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights being about we the people wanting to form a more perfect union. Well, the American Civil Liberties Union has been there since the 1920s to make sure that those civil liberties, those rights that are afforded to us in the Bill of Rights, are extended to everyone. And it recognizes that over time, we evolve, we get better and better at making sure our union is pushing towards that ideal of becoming more and more perfect. So what that means is in any decade, we have a number of issues that come to the forefront. Right now, I guess you wouldn't be surprised to hear that a lot of our work going on has to do with the context of COVID-19 and the nation's spotlight on Black Lives Matter and the national reckoning for racial justice. So Danielle and I are going to talk a little bit more about those issues today. The key areas we focus on are protecting immigrant communities, addressing mass incarceration crisis and the particular dangers, as I spoke about in the time of COVID, in incarceration facilities, making sure to safeguard the right to vote, protecting abortion rights, and protecting our privacy by preventing mass surveillance and preventing government overreach.
So while the ACLU has been advancing racial justice through many pillars of our work, including some that Becky mentioned, including criminal legal system reform and ending mass incarceration, as well as immigrants' rights, the recent uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the spread of protests and demonstrations across the country, the ACLU took a deep look at what our work has been across all of our affiliate network in terms of police accountability and criminal legal system reform, and realized that in addition to the work that we were doing, it's critical for us to take a cue and really learn from the organizations, many of which are Black-led, who are at the front lines of this movement. And so we took a cue from the movement for Black Lives and realized that we need to start thinking about not just reforming police systems, but actually divesting from police and reinvesting in other community services in order to advance racial justice, but also justice more and health more broadly for our communities. The other core work of the ACLU around the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement has been our core work in protecting and defending the right to protest. And we've actually been really proud to be able to partner with Black Lives Matter chapters in different states and cities as our plaintiffs when suing governments in order to make sure that protesters are protected and their right to protest is sustained. And then finally, I would just say that to continue on from what Becky was sharing in terms of our work in the midst of COVID, is that we know that the pandemic has acutely and disproportionately impacted communities of color, especially Black communities and Indigenous communities. And so it's critical that we push our government to properly acknowledge and allocate resources for COVID testing and treatment, because currently not only is there a lack of resources for communities that are disproportionately impacted, but we also know that there are discriminatory practices that are happening that are currently authorized by state and federal administrations. Becky, I would love to hear a little bit from you about how you've seen the dialogue shift in the media around the uprising of BLM and civil liberties at large, just over the past few months, because you have a long history looking at corporate communications, but also broader media. And I feel like you have just an exciting point of view of how our language and our culture is shifting through the way that the media is covering the latest events.
You know, I think it is an interesting thing to think about the fact that the work that we're doing in terms of defending protesters also brings to light the work that we are doing to defend those who cover the protests. Because the journalists have been on the front lines with the suburban moms in cases where federal troops or local law enforcement are using tear gas or rubber bullets. And so these images of I think for me at least, and I think for many others, are in stark contrast. Ooh, that was my Massachusetts accent coming out. Are in stark contrast to what we expect from a democratic society. And so I think it's powerful imagery combined with terms I don't think I grew up hearing, like white supremacy, oppression, and people, I don't know if I would go so far as to say people are becoming more comfortable with this language, but at least the exposure to these concepts is forcing us to confront our perceptions about history and the reality of the society that we're living in. You know, I think a lot about some of the videos that I've watched from our colleague, Jeff Robinson, who has talked about the reality of Confederate monuments and the history of systemic racism in this country. And just watching those videos, I realized how my own education was limited. And I'm a Black person in the United States, you know, but I knew very little about the Tulsa Massacre, and that became a topic of conversation around Juneteenth this year for the first time, at least I can remember in my personal history. And then thinking about the work that Jeff has done and others have done to kind of bring some of these alternative views into the mainstream has been a great thing to watch. And the fact that the newsrooms are responding, you know, some of the newsrooms have come forward to say, okay, we'll now capitalize the B in Black, recognizing, you know, the significance of that. And some have named equity editors for the first time. I mean, these are all great steps because it means that the dialogue will continue to move, as Martin Luther King said, towards the arc of moral justice.
I love that you're bringing up the question of how language has changed and the way that media companies are showing up in different ways, like creating entirely new positions like diversity editors. We, on the team that I sit on at the ACLU, we work with brands and companies, and we've experienced a huge influx of interest from a wide sweeping range of brands from different sectors, wanting to either contribute to our work or seeing if we can be resources to help with exactly the point that you raised of helping to advance the understanding of the systemic racist institutions in our country. We've been working with brands for almost or over a year now to do summits around the reality of barriers to voting for many demographics in this country, whether it's students and young people or First Nation people who live on reservations, or the stark reality of all of the historic voter suppression against the Black community, especially in the South, but not only in the South. And we found that companies thought that this content was riveting and they were really stimulated and engaged by it, But when it came to what content they were interested in sharing with their employees or their broader audiences, they tended to continue to focus on get out the vote efforts, voter registration efforts. And now, post a lot of, whether we see it as virtue signaling or authentic investment in racial justice, a lot of companies are interested in other roles that they can play, whether it's down ballot voter education. So acknowledging that local races like your sheriff's race or your district attorney race or your supervisor of election race can have a huge impact on your racial justice values, or insert another civil rights value that you have. Or whether it's acknowledging that you want to get your employee and customer base actively involved. So the ACLU has a people power mechanism, right, where we can put people to work to help ensure that local election board officials are doing what they need to do to make sure that people have access to the polls. So we're seeing an increased appetite from companies to actually take action, or I should say meaningful action, in addition to some of the safer, or I should say safer past efforts around voting that we know has a direct impact on racial justice.
Yeah, I love that point, Danielle, because I think the courage of companies and the boldness, the threshold is increasing, right? And so where companies may have been shy in the past about dipping their toe into controversial or provocative topics, they're hearing from their employees or their customers that there's no sitting on the sidelines right now. And so that's why I think this series, the Be Heard series, is so important, because not only is it a response to those communities, those stakeholders that are so important to theory, but it's also opening the conversation for other voices to come in. And when I think of the work that we're doing now, particularly on voter rights, there's voter suppression, there's protecting voters in the time of COVID, and then please, I hope it doesn't come to this, but I mean, we are kind of gearing up for a very confusing voting conclusion, right? I mean, people are talking about now, will we even have a decision on November 3rd, or what does voting night look like? And so we are working with so many different actors in that it's like an ecosystem, and it's important that all those voices can be brought into the conversation. So sitting from the ACLU, I think it's great, because when we do the work on racial justice, we have so many partners. We have the Black Lives Matter movement, we have the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, and others, Color of Change. I mean, I could name a whole host. And many of those same actors are side by side with us, shoulder by shoulder with us on the issues of voting. So we have this kind of tag your it mentality when it comes to engaging with corporations and their communities, or talking to the media. Any one of us can show up and know that we're going to be speaking for the interests of the other organization, and make sure that we keep the conversation going, because it can be exhausted, right? And it can sort of feel like, oh my gosh, if I'm the only one in this and I have to talk about it day after day, when do I get a break? And we know that we need to nurture our spirits during this time. So knowing that we have other organizations who are standing by side and willing to step into the conversation, and companies who are willing to create the space to have conversation, is a great benefit. So one thing we both kind of referred to, but we haven't spent time actually articulating, is that it's important to start as close to home as possible. So you referred to it a little bit with companies who are looking to engage in racial justice, and we're saying, and others are saying the same thing, start at home first. And I've heard Anthony Romero, our executive director, speak to this. he was speaking to a group of folks at the Fast Company Impact Council. And he was asking them, as you just said, to look at their leadership structure, to look at the decision-making processes, to make sure that they're rooting out all of the systems of oppression that could be present in their organization. And so I think we should take this advice to heart and think a little bit about what we're doing personally, right? As we engage in this work. So I'll start, because I know this can be a little bit revealing. That'll give you some time to think about your answer, Danielle. For my part, I realized that I had a very outdated view on reparations. I definitely had the kind of 40 acres and a mule kind of thing. And I thought, as our organization is taking a stand in calling for legislation to be passed, HR 40, which specifically asks for a commission to be assembled to look at reparations, that it was important for me to understand what the reality of this concept is. And I was surprised to learn that it's not, in concept and historical reference, obviously we've spoken a lot about 40 acres and a mule, but the idea is really to look at disparities that have played out because of the system of slavery in this country. And so when I think about the wealth gap, when I think about access to education, when I think about health disparities or housing insecurity, all of these issues can be examined through a reparations process. And that has made it really stand out to me as an important next step during this racial reckoning. So that is one thing. And I'll say another personal thing, my family, so I am married and I have 2 kids, one in high school, one in college, and we have started a book club. We are spending a lot of time together these days. So we decided that we would read some books together. And the first one we chose was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. It was good for me because I hadn't read it in a really long time. Like, I don't even want to say how long, but the point was, it was a nice book. It was accessible. It helped us talk as a family about issues, of identity and race and kind of, white supremacy, a whole host of stuff, but in an accessible way. How about you, Danielle? What are you doing?
Such a good question. So a few different things. I think the one that is my heart is racing a little bit in sharing it is acknowledging my own white fragility. I have learned a tremendous amount from a dear friend of mine who's a psychologist, Dr. Buki Kolawale, who has an organization called Relationship HQ. And she's been doing a lot of work to transform her practice to be able to help with anti-oppression and anti-racism training for organizations. And she called me in, which I'm learning that term, called me in at one point to reflect the fact that when I talk about white people, when I'm talking about racial justice, that she felt like it sounded like I wasn't talking about myself. And I realized that on some level, all of the readings that I've done, all of the work that I've done can sometimes appear like a shield or like a way that I'm distancing myself from other white people, which is some kind of defense mechanism, or to my point about what companies sometimes do, maybe I'm sometimes virtue signaling. And so really trying to be self-reflective about what it means to build community across the white folk that I know, and think about what role we can play to build more anti-racist and anti-oppression solidarity work, learn how to operationalize these values that we have. And so another resource that I want to lift up that has been really helpful to me is Austin Channing Brown's book, which is called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness. And there's also a great interview that I highly recommend between her and Brene Brown, which we can include as a resource. But essentially looking at, how can we, or how can I as a white person own the fact that I have white fragility, and that it's really important to become comfortable with being uncomfortable so that I can be a better agent, a better activist, and a better accomplice in dismantling white supremacy. and for my own humanity, not just because it's, you know, hypothetically the right thing to do.
That's so great. Now you've given me another book to add to our family book club reading list. I think maybe as we close this conversation, I'll bring it back to a place where we can maybe leave the Instagram followers with a couple of key actions. So I started out by talking about the ACLU daring to create a more perfect union. I think it's important to recognize that that's beyond any party or side, because this particular moment in time, we have a lot of things to try to divide us and increase the tension in the atmosphere. So let's try and stay focused and advocate for a future democracy that enables a healthy and happy and just experience for us all. So maybe we can each think of one place where we'd like people to go. I think for sure I would love everyone to check out aclu.org/vote. Everyone should have a game plan for this voting cycle. Depending on if you're a marginalized group that's suffering suppression or if you have health concerns, you need to know your options, and I'd encourage you to visit aclu.org/vote to come up with a game plan for voting. How about you, Danielle? Any particular actions?
Absolutely. I would just encourage folks to, in this weird time of COVID, there are more opportunities than I think we're used to as organizers and activists to being active via our couch and our People Power team at the ACLU. So that's peoplepower.org is creating some really valuable opportunities for phone banking, text banking, postcard writing, to help to make sure not only that people are voting and know how to vote, but also shining lights on local elections that have a huge implication for racial justice and other social justice issues. And also shining a light on opportunities to make sure that local governments are providing real opportunities and easy access to the polls, and not continuing to pass policies that make it harder for people to vote.
Well, I think we've given everyone a lot to chew on. I hope there's a lot of chat following this discussion. You know, the ACLU knows that elections aren't the end-all be-all, but we are really hoping that you will exercise your constitutional right to vote. And we need you in it with us, because we have so many issues to come, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. So just consider the voices and experiences of the most impacted people in all that you do. Study, advocate, elevate, and vote.
And vote down ballot.
All right, Theory's Instagram family, we want to thank you for tuning in, and we want to thank Theory for initiating this Be Heard series. On behalf of myself and Danielle and the ACLU, we hope that this conversation has inspired you. It's given you some things to think about and kicks you off on a journey of advocacy to last a lifetime.